Hey, Sydney.
Hello.
Hey, Ray. If you can, Sydney, would you unmute yourself and tell me if you hear hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Ray, can you hear me? Unmute yourself if you can. Tell me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello, can you hear me?
Ray, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, and I can hear him.
Me too. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay.
Hey, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay. Good. All right, let's get started. First of all, tomorrow, I forget 1 o'clock, I think it is. I scheduled a review of Chapter 8. So the exam is going to be on 5, 6 that we read kind of as one chapter, and 7 and 8. Half of the exam will come from the lectures on YouTube and the other half from the book. So tomorrow we review the book. So today, let me get into my notes here. All right. I'm going to go back over a few items that I covered in the last lecture just to bring everybody up to speed. We talked about a priori and a posteriori, synthetic and analytic. Now, a proposition is something that we state, that we say. So a proposition can be logical, like A equals A, which means a thing is identical to itself, or it can mean things like it is raining. So a proposition is either logical or empirical. So if a proposition is a priori, it can be known or can be justified independently of experience. So it's logically true. Triangles have 3 sides. We need not consult a triangle to know this because it's true by its definition. A proposition is a posteriori. Now, a priori is simply Latin for before something. A posteriori is contemporary with or in something. So a proposition is a posteriori if it can be justified only based on experience, the experience of its object. So it would be things like it is raining. The triangle I drew is red. And so you see there is a red triangle here. So we say, yep, that's true. But that's true regardless of what the definition of triangle is. I could say, I've drawn a red book. I don't know why my camera is dropping in and out of existence here. Now, a proposition is analytic if it is true based on the mere interpretations of its concepts, i.e., based on meaning alone. Like A equals A, bachelors are unmarried is true based on the very meaning of the concept bachelor as an unmarried man. So it's logically true. The proposition is synthetic. Move camera. Man, technology is failing me today. A proposition is analytic if it is true based on the mere interpretation of its concept. Proposition is synthetic if it is made true only by something outside its concepts, i.e., by objects of the concepts. A proposition is synthetic if it's made true only by something outside of concepts, like the objects of its concepts. All right, we talked about this later. This is just going over for the third time what we talked about. An example of this would be bachelors are jovial. And this is not true based on the meaning of bachelor alone, because bachelors need not be happy people. But it's made true or false by whether the entities referred to by the concept bachelor are jovial. Is this particular bachelor jovial? Now, synthetic a priori is the category added by Kant, and the type of judgments that Kant is talking about here are God, morality, ethics, the immortality of the soul, free will is another one. So those are things which are synthetic a priori judgments. They are necessary for experience. They underlie experience. Now, I would contrast this with, let me turn over here. Analytic a priori judgments are based on things like space and time. Quantity, quality, quantity would be this is a red pen, or this is a pen. Quality would equal red. Relationships. Now, he doesn't mean like family relationships here, but he means size comparisons, how things relate to each other, and modality. In what mode is something in? So those are all things, space and time, quantity, quality, relationships, and modality. Those are all things that are analytic a priori judgments. Now I want to get into a little bit about Kant and his ethics, because so far we've talked about Kant's ontology and his epistemology. And as we learned a long time ago, those are the things which underline a real philosophy. Now, understand this clearly, because I'm probably going to ask a question about this on the exam. This is the vast difference between Kant, Aristotle, and Plato on one hand, and people like Mill and Bentham and Hobbes on the other hand, who are not trained philosophers, whose system is not based on any modality at all, simply opinion, whose epistemology and whose ontology is either non-existent or faulty. So we began our study because we didn't want to be grouped with those people who are basing their judgments on mere opinion, what everybody thinks. We wanted to go deeper to establish truth. And this is what Kant is after. They're all different now, but Kant's after this, Aristotle's after this, Plato's after this. And even though they may differ in their approaches, their intent is the same. All right, a little bit of something about Immanuel Kant. He was born into a pietistic Lutheran family in Königsberg and spent his whole life within 25 miles of where he was born. Lectured at the University of Königsberg, which was in Prussia at that time. It's in Poland today because the Germans lost the Second World War. He was renowned for his punctuality. He had a batman or a personal servant. What do you call it? The English have them. I can't remember the name now, but he had a guy who worked for him, who carried his umbrella, and every morning at 9 o'clock, Professor Kant walked out of his house and took a walk around Königsberg. The town experts actually would, if the clock was off, if the clock showed 5 after and Kant came out of the house, they would reset the clock to 9 o'clock because that's how punctual Professor Kant was. And as a matter of fact, he's famous for that in German intellectual life. Leonhard Euler, probably, if not the greatest mathematician in history, he certainly was a great one. He invented graph theory. And that graph theory is based on the philosopher's walk, where he paradigmed a mathematical proposition out of Kant's travel around the bridges of Königsberg. Now, Kant's famous for a lot of things, but even in his what's called the systematic works, there are two things that I want you to remember about Kant, and this will become clear as we read the chapter together tomorrow. Kant's famous for the statement, there is nothing good but a good will. Sorry about my camera here. For some reason, it's being ornery today. There's nothing good but a good will, which means that you can only be blamed for your intentions. If you intended something as good, that's really all that counts for a moral decision. You can't be held responsible for things that are not in your control. And I've used this example, I think, before, but if we were in normal times and we had class and we were all headed back home from class and I had an accident and you came across my wrecked car and it was turned upside down, flames were beginning to engulf the car. I was hanged there by my seatbelt. And you know that if you don't get me out of the car, then I'm going to die. Painful, horrible death in flames. And so you get out your trusty Swiss Army knife and you cut the seatbelt loose, intending to save me. And I accidentally fall into the ceiling top of my car and break my neck and it kills me. You are not legally responsible for my death. And most states have what they call the Good Samaritan law that protects you from lawsuits when you try to save someone's life like that and your attempts fail. So, those are all based on this idea of there's nothing good but a good will. He's also famous, and this is another pre-systematic philosophy statement from his early works. Morality is nothing more than what every well-brought-up child should know. So morality is essentially simple. And even though we're going to find out that Kant goes, and we've seen he's a very sincere, very difficult philosopher, but he begins and ends with this simple proposition that morality is just simple goodness. So back to the synthetic analytic idea for just a moment. Kant's teacher was Martin Knudsen, who was a student of Christian Wolff, who was a student of Leibniz, who was who participated, who accepted to some degree Descartes' philosophy, and we've talked about Descartes in the past. So Kant was trained in Descartes, but he reads actively, even though he is a professor who never went 25 miles away from home. He reads extensively European literature at the time. So he reads Hume, and we've talked about Hume for a couple of lectures. He reads Hume, he reads Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher of the French Enlightenment. He says that Kant awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. And as we said before, he realized most people, most English philosophers said, oh, isn't it cool that Hume denies the existence of God, so we can't know God. So they weren't so much afraid of that proposition. English philosophy was not, for the general rule. But Kant understood that this was something even more serious than religion, which was at stake here. he understood that science is at stake. If it's true that Hume is a solipsist, now I talked about that in lecture 1. Go back and think about that. Hume is a solipsist. There is, Kant very clearly recognized this. We can't know anything according to Hume. Now that doesn't just attack God, that attacks our very presence in the world. We can't do anything. We just simply give up and say, oh, I might as well be a hermit. I don't know anything, can't know anything. Nothing's true. I give up. I retreat. Eat, drink, and be merry, or go live in a cave someplace because everything is the same. He realized that that was a problem and that he had to answer that. Not only, it's not so much that he intends to save God here, because he's going to deny the existence of God in terms of the traditional proofs of the existence of God that the medievals had come up with and Descartes had come up with. He's going to say they don't work, but at the same time, he brings God back through the back door to say that God is simply a fragment of our imagination, I guess we might say. God is one of those things like free will that we have to assume. We have to assume God. We have to assume free will if we are to make our headway in the world. So God, morality, all of these things are necessary for our experience the way we have constructed the world. So he has to answer Hume. He has to answer Hume not just for the sake of God, he has to answer Hume for the sake of science, mathematics, all of these things which we think bring us superior, if not erudite, knowledge. So this is the reason that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, and he realized that Hume must be responded to. But remember that Kant agrees with Hume to a certain degree here. We cannot know the thing in itself. And by that, he means not just God, which Hume would say, but we cannot know the table or the chair or the pen or anything in itself. We simply know our impression of that. That's all that we know. Now, the one thing that does make Kant different as opposed to Hume is he understands that there are checks and balances for these things. We can check in with each other. We take a poll. We say, how many people see a red pen here? And if somebody doubts that there's a red pen here, then we all think, hey, there's something wrong with that person. He's either lying to us or she is a little bit off. Because we can check one by one and say, yeah, I see a pen. Yeah, I see a pen. Yeah, I see a pen. So that is open to us, so that there is a statistical, if not inductive, process of knowledge that does establish at least probability. We know only by judgment and comparing our judgment, whether it be a posteriori or a priori. Remember our discussions before just a minute ago about those types of propositions. We know only through those propositions. Those propositions are called Beurteilung in German. So by checking in with each other informally or by scientific analysis, remember science does this, or it should do this. What is one of the criteria for scientific truth? That's repeatability, right? So if I do an experiment and find X, Y, or Z through that experiment, then you, as another scientist, should be able to use my data, use my information, repeat my experiment, and come up with the exact same results. Repeatability. So that's one of the ways that science sort of proves Kant's position here. It's the reason we say that Kant's analysis here is logical and scientific. So by checking together, whether it be informally or through science, asking each other is really an informal science. It's really an informal repeatability. Do you see that? So I began to think, if I know that most of the people in the class see this, then I begin to know that I'm not necessarily seeing things myself. And so we are seeing the same thing. Now, that may not be the thing in itself, Kant says, but it is really good proof that we are at least on the right track. So another move there from Verteilung, we derive Vernunft, which is German for understanding. The object, remember, the table that we're looking at, all of us, the chair, whatever we're looking at, has no privilege. There's nothing in existence. There's nothing to say that that in itself thing is true, except for our fact checking. So we don't actually see into the reality of things. Reality is a mental construct. Hence, Immanuel Kant is an idealist. Don't forget that. The idea is the real. Now, Plato had said that the idea is the real, remember, but a different idea. For Kant, this is mental. For Plato, he said that the idea was non-mental, non-physical. For Kant, it is mental. All right.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So I was listening to a lecture on YouTube. Is this the same thing where you said that Kant was, he like perceived that if you couldn't see it, then it wasn't there unless it was only there because God put it there? Is that
No,
what that was?
that was Descartes.
Oh,
Descartes,
okay, sorry.
Descartes is an idealist too, but for him, for Plato, the form out there in the realm of the forms makes the individual thing real. For Descartes, it is God that makes everything real. And for Descartes, God makes everything real. For Kant, the thing is not real. It's only statistically real because we, through our own concepts, check in with each other to make sure we're seeing the same thing. Does that make sense, Sydney?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So Plato says the realm of the forms makes the thing real. Descartes says God makes the thing real, so that when I see something, God keeps the place and makes sure that what I see is the truth. For Kant, I don't know the truth. The only way I can come to the truth is by a statistical scientific measure. But we do mostly see the same thing, don't we? I mean, if I put a table in front of the room, if we're all in a room, if I put a table in front of the room, only someone who was silly and wanted to start an argument would say, I don't see that table, right? So that's not what Kant says that's not what we would ideally like, but it's a lot. It means that statistically we see the same thing, which is to it's significant. All right. Now I'm transitioning to his ethics here, and that's where we're going to pick up the book, because the book foregoes, unfortunately, the background for the reason Kant does something. And that's the reason you should have professors. Your teachers should tell you these backgrounds so that you can be a wiser, more intelligent critic of material. So I'm filling in these backgrounds for you about why Kant says he does what he does. And then in the book, we're going to read, for the most part, what he does say about ethics. All right, but I've got to discuss one more level here before we turn to the book tomorrow. As I say, he is trained as a rationalist, which, and rationalism says that the idea of things is innate. So the thing in the brain is more real than the thing on the table. The idea of pen is more real than this pen. That's rationalism. Kant was trained in that tradition. So you see how he's rejected that. On the other hand, the other alternative, as far as the ontology of this goes, is empiricism. And for empiricism, truth only comes from experience. We don't have any innate ideas. So we simply learn that this is a pen. Mamas and daddies and teachers say, when you see that thing, it's a pen. Well, that doesn't look like that. And here's a stylus for writing on my tablet. That's a pen of some sort. The only way we learn the differences between these things for empiricists is we simply have to learn them. So there's nothing prior to experience. The great English philosopher John Locke if you ever get a chance to look into John Locke, please do so. John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant, in many and different ways, very much influenced the American intellectual life. The French and German Enlightenment was essential for understanding what happened in America when the Constitution was written. All of these philosophies underlie the American constitutional experience. John Locke is, most of the founders were very much influenced by Locke because, of course, he wrote in English. They not many, well, quite a few actually. There's a lot of a German influence in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, for instance, that were quite conversant with Kant. So in many ways, Kant did inform his idea of the individual does inform the absolute critical core of the individual. The most important thing, supposedly, in American intellectual life is the individual. That's the reason that the vote is so sacred per person. That's a Kantian influence. That's based on the worth of the individual. We'll talk about that when we get into the textbook. John Locke is famous for saying that the person is a tabula rasa. Tabula is Latin for tablet, and rasa is nothing. We would say blank. So you would say that the human experience is a blank slate upon which experience writes. So there's nothing prior to experience. But now here's the simple deal of Kant. This is, most of the great things in this universe are simple things. And this is a simple revelation that Kant had that makes all of the difference in the world and makes Kant absolutely right about this and makes him one of the greatest thinkers in the history of the world. Kant's refutation is very simple. There is something prior to experience. The tablet. There's something that is sort of universal. And that is that we've all got this tablet. Kant says, rather than being a blank slate, this proves my point. We all have this tablet, and it's basically the same. We're born with it. We're not necessarily born with innate ideas, but we're born with a platform up here on which to write. So there is something universal and eternal and ongoing, Kant says. That tablet itself, and that tablet is the same. My tablet is the same as your tablet. That's the reason that even if we speak different languages, we understand this by the word that we use for pen or pennon or whatever word we use. We don't think that it means something else. So this holds true, Kant says, across everything that we call human. It is a universal. It's universally true. Now, does that mean that it's really real? Nah, not necessarily. There's nothing of itself that is real. But it is the assumption that we all make whenever we begin to speak. So, epistemologically and ontologically, we can sum up by saying, while we don't know as much as we thought, while we may not know as much as Descartes and even Plato and Aristotle thought that we knew, we know much more than what English empiricism assumed and far more than what Hume's solipsism taught. So empiricism devolves into a challenge of skepticism. That's a lot to accomplish. So empiricism turns out not to be right about much of anything. And according to Kant, at least, we have saved not only theology, but we've also saved logic, math, philosophy, and even humanity itself. Because if there's nothing real, if there's nothing that we know, if there's nothing that's important, then egregious activities are just as okay. as benign and benevolent activities. Now, in transition to the book tomorrow, the most important thing from the standpoint of ethics and morality for Kant is that for Kant, it's the absolute integrity of the individual that is the most important thing in the world. There's a story about when Kant was in his 90s in a wheelchair. His physician came to check on him, and as the physician walked into the room, the old man attempted to stand, and he was so weak that he could barely stand, but he struggled to his feet in his doctor's presence, and the doctor said, "Here, Professor, you need not rise, because I am a doctor." To which Kant replied, "I rise, sir, not because you're a doctor, but because you are a human being." So for Kant, if it had been his gardener, he would have stood at attention. That's how important that's what makes everything real for Kant, is the individual, him or herself. Now, there's also something which comes back to us because of this, because we are the unique thing in all of the world, because the individual person is the most important thing in all of the world. That means that we need to take care of ourselves physically and intellectually. We need to be the best that we can. We need to develop into the most and the best thing that we possibly can. And it's that end that Kant wants to serve in his understanding of deontological ethics. Let me say one more thing here, because when you get to the book, you're not going to see this in the book. And this is another reason you need people that know what they're talking about. The word deontology comes from the Greek word deon. Now, everybody, with the possible exception of German scholars that know Kant well, and Greek scholars, everybody but them translates this as duty. The problem is, deon is not duty. Deon in Greek means necessity. So this is an example of deon. If you've got 2 and 2 and you have these, you have 4. You must, if you have 2 and another 2, a plus sign and an equal sign, you are bound to come up with 4. It is a logical necessity. So rather than being duty, duty sounds too much like, when we say duty, we think of military. So when Kant talks about, or when we say that Kant talks about, well, we do say, people that don't know, including, for the most part, you're the textbook author. He does not know Kant that well. So he calls Kant's ethics a duty ethics. And that is absolutely wrong. For Kant, once we posit the worth of the individual, then we are, by necessity, required to uphold that dignity in ourselves and in other people. So we are to care, respect, dare I say, love ourselves and each other. Those are very important words for our time. It's very important words for the American experience that have made accidents of birth sometimes a reality that is non-existent, and developed ethics on the basis of those opinions rather than logical necessity that Kant talks about. So once we have posited individuality, both in ourselves and others, we are duty bound by this understanding, this logical necessity to uphold the worth of ourselves and others. And that's what Kant means by deontology. And you should translate it as necessity as opposed to duty, logical necessity. All right, now as we end, let me give you some time frames. Tomorrow on the 18th at, I think it's at 1 o'clock, we are going to go over the textbook, sort of line by line. I'm going to tell you what you need to know from that chapter. Then on the 19th in the evening, late evening, I'm going to send out the second exam. That second exam, one half the questions will come from the lectures. Remember now, we're talking about 3 or 4 chapters here. We're talking about 5, 6, 7, and 8. Although we treated 5 and 6 as if they were one chapter, remember we read chapter 6 before we read chapter 5. So we got 6, 5, 7, and 8. One half of the questions will come from the lectures. And I mean my lectures and not what somebody on the internet says. So you will be held to responding to what I say. Or you don't have to agree with me, but you must address what I say. The second part of the exam will come from the readings of chapters 6 and 5, 7, 8, and 9. Again, it will be due the week after that. So I give you a week to work on it. And if everybody, I mean, if you're having some difficulty, you can have a little bit more time. But it just delays like it did the last time, it delays the grading because I want to grade you on how you figure into what everybody else is doing and not my absolute standard. So I need, data-wise, I need a lot of papers in order to establish a grade scheme that is fair to everybody. Okay, if anybody got any questions?
After this exam, we have one more, right?
That's right, the last day of class.
Okay.
Whatever the last day of class would be for your section is the day the exam will be due. And I'll send that out probably a week before. I think the last day of class is like the 15th or 16th of December. That quiz is not going to be as long. I may not give you a week on that. I may give you just a few days because we're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle. That's all we've got left after we finish with Kant. So there won't be as much material. There won't be as many chapters to read. As a matter of fact, it's going to be mostly lecture. So, probably won't give you a whole week on that because it'll be shorter. Everybody cool? All right. I'm going to sign off if we don't have any more questions. Again, please, you know that if you need me, all you have to do is send me a personal message and I'll set up a Zoom meeting so that we can discuss what you need to discuss. Okay? All right. I'm gonna check out of here. See you guys later.